last summer. And they all tell us that these types of techniques don't extract any you can't get actionable intelligence by using coercive methods. Really, the way that they know to extract intelligence is by building rapport with the individuals who you're interviewing. And in fact, using coercive methods can also often lead to false information, lead to false leads. It tends to waste time. And it can also create a situation where that individual is never going to give you good information, because you can't go back from coercive interrogation. You can't then start to build a rapport with that individual. You can disrupt the relationship so that you'll never be able to get good information down the line from
all fine and good if you have plenty of time. But what about the ticking time bomb circumstance where you need that intelligence right now because you fear that there's an imminent attack in which thousands of civilians might be injured?
So essentially, you're describing what has been sort of known as the 24 scenario that we see Jack Bauer on the TV show 24. I believe
24,
it's just the new season just started this week, and I think that it's really that type of description of a scenario is a red herring. First of all, it is dependent upon the idea that in a quick amount of time you can get good information by using coercive interrogation techniques, and there's nothing out there. There's no evidence proving that if you have an hour or 2 hours and you torture somebody that you'll get that good information. It's simply not, there's no evidence proving that. Certain studies done by the Defense Science College indicate that there is absolutely no scientific evidence that you can get good information in a short amount of time.
The Senate Armed Services Committee report goes back to the presidential determination that the United States would no longer honor Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions as setting off the chain of circumstances leading to Abu Ghraib. Could that really be established in any plausible sense that there is a direct linkage between these events?
Well, certainly legal memos that were issued by the Department of Justice stating that Common Article 3 did not apply to the Taliban or Al-Qaeda appear to have been intended to give legal cover for the type of coerced interrogations that were used in Guantanamo, Afghanistan, and Iraq. Some of these techniques were beginning to be employed before those types of legal memos were issued, but it's clear that Common Article 3 would have prohibited all of these techniques. None of these techniques, and the military, anyone that you ask in the military, including the top military lawyers, what we call TJAGs, Judge Advocate Generals, will say very easily that all of these techniques violate Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions.
And indeed, many people in the military, in a very honorable way, came forward and said that we shouldn't be doing this.
Yes, absolutely, and they've come out a number of times saying so, and one of the reasons why military leaders feel so strongly about the need to uphold Common Article 3, whether we're talking about the Department of Defense or we're talking about agents from the CIA or any U.S. government agency, is because once you start to degrade that standard, you start putting U.S. troops and U.S. personnel who are stationed abroad in danger, because they rely on that standard for protection should they be taken into custody. And that's why you have seen so many military leaders. Human Rights First at one point helped organize the letter where over 50 admirals, former admirals and generals signed on to a letter advocating that Common Article 3 be upheld and that there be a single standard for all U.S. agencies when it comes to interrogation and humane treatment of prisoners.
Now, the degradation in U.S. policy and treatment began at Guantanamo, then moved to Afghanistan, and then from Afghanistan to Iraq. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, who authorized the use of aggressive techniques, would you say that he thought that even what he authorized wasn't really he thought he was being pretty restrained, didn't he? He made some joking comments, in fact, about forcing people to stand up for extended periods of time as some kind of torture, right?
Essentially, I think, well, if you look at the legal memos, there were some proposed methods in those legal memos, such as beatings, a pretty severe form of interrogation that Rumsfeld declined to authorize. But he did authorize a number of other cruel techniques. And in one of these memos, he did write with, you can see it, it's a publicly available document, it's available on the web. He wrote with his own hand that he didn't understand why you could only make someone stand for 4 hours, because he stood 8 hours a day in his job, which clearly doesn't take into account the fact that when you're holding somebody against their will, forcing them to stand often in positions that are made to create pain, and can in fact cause severe risk to health and even to life because of the fear of blood clots. Those types of circumstances and risks are obviously not associated when somebody's simply standing for
Let's talk about
work.
the case of Mohammed al-Qahtani. Tell me about his detention and what happened to his.
Well, Mohammed al-Qahtani was, he had tried to enter the United States in 2001 at the Miami airport and was in fact refused. And that's the first, what he's accused of, having tried to enter the United States to participate in the 9/11 attacks. He was then eventually detained by the U.S. government and was one of the first detainees subject to some of the cruelest techniques. Eventually, al-Qahtani was brought to Guantanamo. The entire log of his interrogation is also publicly available, and it includes some very horrific treatment, including the use of hypothermia. He was in fact reportedly hospitalized for hypothermia because of the cold temperatures that he was subjected to in his interrogation. He was also reportedly subjected to severe humiliation, as well as forced standing and other abusive measures during his interrogation.
And what was the outcome? What were the findings ultimately in his case?
Well, there have been no ultimate findings in his case at this point. Not all of the information regarding his interrogation is public. If you look at the Department of Justice Inspector General report, a lot of the part of that report on his interrogation is in fact redacted. And it's also not clear yet whether or not there will be any successful charges against al-Qahtani. There were initially charges brought, and then those charges were dropped. There were assertions made that the charges were dropped because some of the information had been gathered through coercive and abusive interrogations. However, recently in November 2008, charges were brought again in the military commission system. When the prosecutor brought those charges, they claimed that there was new evidence that wasn't relied on coercive interrogation. So we'll see, where we go from here. The hope would be that if any charges are brought against al-Qahtani, they would be brought in the regular U.S. federal criminal courts.
In a new administration, in President-elect now, soon-to-be President Obama, saying that he will not authorize the use of torture, that we're going to abide by the Geneva Conventions. But going back in time, looking back at what's happened, he also says that we're not going to bring criminal charges, probably, unless somebody has blatantly broken the law. An unusual legal standard for sure. What is your sense about to what extent should we be attempting to hold criminally accountable the Bush administration and the principals in the Bush administration that were responsible for the torture policy?
Well, it's a difficult question politically, I think. What I am glad to see that President-elect Obama hasn't taken anything off the table at this point, which I think is important. And there are some discrete ways in which they can leave open this possibility. One being there is an ongoing investigation into the destruction of certain CIA tapes of cruel interrogation. And one of our suggestions is that investigation be expanded to include not just the destruction of the tapes, but the infliction and the authorization of the techniques on the tapes. So I think there are still some more discrete ways in which they might look at the potential for bringing criminal prosecutions should the evidence warrant. Obviously, there are a number of potential defenses that could be brought that might prevent legal defenses that might prevent such cases being brought, including issues having to do with the chain of command and legal authorization. and those defenses were enshrined into law in the Detainee Treatment Act and the Military Commissions Act that was passed in 2006. But certainly, he shouldn't be taking any forms of accountability off the counter at this point until he really has a chance to look through all of the documents and understand exactly who was involved and how these techniques came to be authorized. And certainly, there should be a fuller accounting of what actually happened.
We're going to have to leave it right there, but many thanks to Devin Chafee of Human Rights First for walking us through the legal, ethical, and policy issues associated with U.S. treatment of prisoners, enemy combatants, and terrorist suspects, and more on this coming up in a minute. I'm Mark Cohen, and this has been